The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the Silver Spoon restaurant, creating a symphony of gentle taps that matched the quiet murmur of conversations inside. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across polished mahogany tables, while waitstaff in crisp black uniforms moved gracefully between them like shadows in a carefully choreographed dance. Among them, Grace Elizabeth Thompson stood out, not because she wanted to, but because of an inherent elegance that no uniform could disguise. Her auburn hair was neatly tied back, revealing high cheekbones and intelligent green eyes that missed nothing. 10 years of service had taught her to read people like open books, and tonight's customer at table 7 was an interesting chapter indeed. Benjamin Michael Anderson, tech billionaire and notorious difficult guest, sat alone at his regular table, absently adjusting his platinum cufflinks. His steely gaze followed Grace's every movement with calculation that made her skin prickle. Something about his presence felt different tonight, more focused, more deliberate. What Grace didn't know was that this evening would change everything. "Your usual, Mr. Anderson?" Grace approached with practiced professionalism. "Actually," he looked up, his expression unreadable. "Surprise me. Whatever you think best, price is no object." His lips curled into what might have been a smile or a smirk. "Consider it a test of your expertise." Grace's spine stiffened imperceptibly. After earning 2 culinary degrees and running her own restaurant before family obligations forced her to sell, being tested by anyone, even a billionaire, struck a nerve. "Very well, sir." Her voice remained perfectly modulated. "Any allergies or preferences I should be aware of?" "None." He leaned back, studying her with the air of someone who had just placed a bet. "Though I must warn you, I'm quite particular about my food. The last 3 restaurants I visited, well, let's just say they're no longer in business." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Grace merely nodded and turned away, her mind already racing through possibilities. What Benjamin Anderson didn't realize was that he had just challenged the wrong person. In the kitchen, Grace moved with purpose. "Chef Samuel," she addressed the head chef, "I need a favor." Samuel James White looked up from plating a dish. He'd known Grace long enough to recognize the fire in her eyes. "What's our favorite billionaire done now?" "He wants to play games." Grace's fingers drummed against the steel counter. "Remember that dish we created for the James Beard competition 5 years ago, before I had to sell my restaurant?" Samuel's eyes widened. "The one that won you?" "Yes." Grace's smile was sharp as a knife's edge. "I still have the recipe memorized. Would you mind if I—" "The kitchen is yours." Samuel stepped aside with a flourish. "Show him what real cuisine looks like." For the next 45 minutes, Grace worked with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of an artist. Each ingredient was selected with care, each technique executed flawlessly. The result was a dish that told a story, her story, on a plate. Benjamin Anderson was growing impatient when Grace finally returned with a covered silver dome. The restaurant had quieted, as if holding its breath. "Your dinner, sir." With a fluid motion, she lifted the dome. The presentation was stunning, a modern interpretation of classical French cuisine with an Asian fusion twist. Steam carried aromatic hints of herbs and spices that made mouths water 3 tables away. "This is—" For the first time that evening, Anderson appeared genuinely surprised. Pan-seared duck breast with a cherry fig reduction, accompanied by wild mushroom risotto and baby vegetables in a light truffle emulsion. Grace's voice was calm, professional. "The dish won the James Beard Foundation Award in 2020. Anderson's head snapped up. "Impossible. That award went to Grace Elizabeth's in Chicago. The owner was—" He stopped abruptly, really looking at her for the first time. "You're Grace Elizabeth." It wasn't a question. "Your restaurant was considered one of the best in the country. Then you suddenly closed and disappeared." "Life happens, Mr. Anderson." Grace's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sometimes we make choices based on what's right, rather than what's profitable." He gestured to her uniform. "And this is right? Serving tables instead of running your own kitchen?" "My mother needed full-time care. The restaurant's insurance wouldn't cover it. Sometimes pride must bow to necessity." Her voice remained steady, but her hands clasped tightly behind her back. "Please, enjoy your meal while it's hot." Anderson cut into the duck, raised a bite to his lips, and froze. The flavors were extraordinary, a perfect balance of sweet, savory, and umami that told the story of decades of dedication to craft. "Sit down." Anderson pointed to the chair across from him. "I'm working, sir." "Sit down." He pulled out his phone, tapped rapidly, then showed her the screen. "I just purchased this restaurant." Grace's composure cracked slightly. "You... what?" "Bought it 10 minutes ago. The owner was quite pleased with my offer." He gestured again to the chair. "Now, as your new employer, I'm asking you to sit down." Grace slowly sank into the seat, her mind racing. The other diners were starting to stare. "Why did you really close your restaurant?" Anderson cut straight to the point. "I told you, my mother needed—" "No," he interrupted. "The truth. All of it." Grace's fingers twisted in her lap. "You really want to know? Fine. It was people like you." "Excuse me?" Anderson's eyebrows rose. "Wealthy investors who saw something successful and decided they had to own it. They came with their offers and their threats and their backdoor deals until my suppliers started mysteriously canceling. My staff began receiving better offers elsewhere, and my credit lines suddenly dried up." She leaned forward, years of frustration finally finding voice. "I could have fought it, should have fought it. But then my mother's condition worsened, and I couldn't risk." She straightened. "Well, it doesn't matter now." "And if I told you I was one of those investors?" Anderson's voice was quiet. "Were you?" "Number. But I could have been." He studied her with new respect. "I make a habit of testing people, Miss Thompson. It's how I built my empire, finding exceptional talent in unexpected places. I'm not interested in being another acquisition, Mr. Anderson." "What about a partnership?" Grace laughed, but there was no humor in it. "A partnership? With someone who just bought an entire restaurant to force a conversation?" "Yes." He was dead serious. "I'm opening a culinary academy, not just any school, one that will be accessible to talented chefs regardless of their financial situation. I need someone to run it who understands both excellence and reality. Someone who knows what it means to sacrifice everything for family." Grace sat very still, processing his words. "Why me?" "Because you just served me the best meal I've had in 5 years, without access to your own kitchen or staff. Because instead of compromising your standards, you chose to start over. And because when faced with a bully trying to test you, you chose to demonstrate excellence rather than surrender." What's the catch? Grace's years in the industry had taught her there was always a catch. No catch, full creative control, a salary that would make a corporate CEO envious, and, he paused for effect, complete medical coverage for all employees and their immediate family members. Grace's hands trembled slightly. "My mother would have the best care available." Anderson set down his fork. "I did my research, Ms. Thompson. Your story, it's not unique. Too many talented people are forced to abandon their dreams because of circumstances beyond their control. I want to change that." "Why? What do you get out of this?" "Legacy." He smiled, and for the first time that evening, it seemed genuine. "I've made more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. Now I want to make a difference." "I have conditions," Grace said after a long moment. "Name them." "The Academy accepts students based on talent and passion, not connections or ability to pay. We create scholarships for those who need them." "Done." "I want to bring in my own team, starting with Samuel White from the kitchen." "Naturally." "And I want my old restaurant space back, not to reopen it, to turn it into the Academy's first campus." Anderson's eyes sparkled with interest. "That building was bought by—" "Shell Corporations owned by Lewis Holdings." Grace met his gaze steadily. "I may be a waitress now, Mr. Anderson, but I never stopped paying attention to what happened to my dream." He nodded slowly, impressed. "I'll have my team start negotiations tomorrow." "One more thing." Grace stood, smoothing her apron. "That test you mentioned, about making restaurants go out of business?" "Ah, that." Anderson had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "A bluff, actually, though I have invested in several successful establishments." "Then let me be clear. I don't play games, Mr. Anderson. Not with people's livelihoods, not with their dreams, and certainly not with their futures. If we do this, we do it honestly and ethically. No tests, no power plays, no hidden agendas. Direct and principled. He nodded approvingly. I can work with that. Good. Grace gestured to his barely touched plate. Now, your dinner's getting cold, and I have other tables to attend to. Shall we continue this discussion tomorrow, properly? The next morning, Grace stood outside the Silver Spoon in the crisp autumn air, watching the sunrise paint the city gold. Her uniform was folded neatly in her bag, along with a letter of resignation. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down to reveal Anderson's face. Ready to begin? Grace took one last look at the restaurant that had been her refuge for the past decade. Actually, there's somewhere we need to go first. 20 minutes later, they stood before a red brick building with boarded windows. The faded outline of Grace Elizabeth's was still visible above the door. It looks smaller than I remember, she murmured. We'll restore it. Anderson surveyed the building with a developer's eye. Make it even better than before. It's not about making it better. Grace touched the old brass door handle, remembering countless nights of service, of triumph and exhaustion. It's about making it matter. She turned to face Anderson. You know, when I first opened this place, I thought success meant Michelin stars and James Beard awards. Now I know it's about something else entirely. And what's that? Creating opportunities, teaching others what I learned the hard way. She smiled, thinking of her mother, who had always encouraged her to dream bigger, making sure talent doesn't get lost because of circumstances. Anderson pulled out his phone, quickly typing something. The offer on the building has been accepted. It's yours, or rather, the Academy's. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes but blinked them away. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. 6 months later, the Grace Elizabeth Culinary Academy opened its doors. The first class included a former dishwasher with an extraordinary palate, a single mother who cooked like an angel, and a retired veteran who had learned to bake in war zones. Grace stood at the podium, looking out at their eager faces. Samuel White, now the Academy's head instructor, gave her a thumbs up from the back row. Welcome, she began, to your future. Some of you are here because you've dreamed of this all your lives. Others found your way to cooking through unexpected paths. What matters isn't how you got here, but what you'll do with the opportunity. In the audience, Benjamin Anderson sat quietly, watching his investment transform into something priceless, hope. Later that evening, Grace visited her mother, who was thriving in her new care facility. I saw the news coverage, her mother said proudly. My daughter, changing lives. Grace took her mother's hand. I learned from the best. You taught me that sometimes the hardest choices lead to the most beautiful destinations. As she drove home that night, Grace passed the Silver Spoon. The restaurant was still there, still serving excellent meals to demanding customers. But now it was just one chapter in a much larger story. She thought about the test that had started it all, a billionaire's attempt to prove his own superiority that had instead revealed something far more valuable, the power of dignity, determination, and staying true to one's principles. Sometimes life's greatest tests aren't the ones we're given, but the ones we choose to face head-on.